The photos were for Marlowe. Marlowe with the soft mouth, and the Sunday mornings and the year of quiet circling we had decided to stop pretending about. I took them in my bedroom at 7 in the evening with the curtains half drawn and the lamp doing something useful to the light. I attached them to the message. I hit send. I felt like a person in full possession of her own life. Then my phone made the second sound, the one it makes when you send something to the wrong thread. I looked down. The recipient was not Marlowe. The recipient was Professor Elise Hollis, my thesis advisor. The woman who'd spent 9 months pretending not to see me. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description, tell us where you are watching from, and subscribe. I do not remember standing up. I remember being on my feet. I remember the phone in my hand and the quiet electric hum of my apartment, and the specific surgical way my vision had narrowed to the confirmation dialogue on the screen. Sent. 3 photographs. The kind you take when you have decided that a woman with a soft mouth and a year of patient mutual circling has earned every honest thing you have to give. The kind you do not send to anyone else. The kind you never, never, under any circumstance, send to your dissertation advisor. I scrolled the thread. The name at the top was Hollis, E., because that was how I had saved her the night I had gotten her cell number for a conference emergency in Berlin last September, and because I had never changed it. Changing it would have meant admitting that I thought about her enough to want her contact to look different. And I had spent 9 months pretending I did not think about her that much. The thread below her name was sparse. A handful of academic exchanges, the dates I had defended my prospectus, the PDF she had sent me at 3 in the morning last March with the one-line note. This argument is yours. Stop apologizing for it. And now, at the bottom, 3 images. I sat down. Not because I wanted to, because my legs had stopped being something I could reliably use. I was 26 years old. I was in the final year of a PhD in comparative literature at a university whose name got me seated at dinner tables I did not belong at. I was working on a dissertation about women's epistolary silences in the long 19th century, which is a polite academic way of saying I had spent 4 years thinking about what women say when they cannot say the real thing. I was, in theory, the kind of person who should have understood immediately what was happening to me. I did not. I stared at the confirmation dialogue for what I would later estimate was 9 minutes. Then I did what any reasonable person does when they have sent intimate photographs to their academic advisor by accident on a Saturday night. I put the phone face down on the kitchen counter, walked into the bathroom, and stood under a very cold shower for 6 minutes. When I came out, the phone had a new notification. I did not pick it up. I made tea. I watched the tea. I considered the specific ways in which my entire academic career had just ended. I thought about the hooding ceremony I would now not attend. I thought about the 3 years of work I had just vaporized. I thought about the letter of recommendation she had been planning to write for the postdoctoral fellowship at Yale. Then I picked up the phone. The message was from Elise Hollis. It said, "I have not opened the attachments. Delete the thread. We will speak Monday." I read it 3 times. The sentence "I have not opened the attachments" was doing specific work. It was not "I did not open." It was "I have not opened." Present perfect. A grammatical choice. A woman who had built her career on the epistolary silences of women in the long 19th century would not, on a Saturday evening, make a grammatical choice by accident. I have not opened meant I have not yet. It meant I am not, in this moment, certain whether I will. And the next line. Delete the thread. Not delete the photographs. Not delete what you sent me. The thread. The entire exchange. The record of it. As if she were advising me how to protect myself. As if she had been thinking about how to protect me specifically. I sat on the edge of my bed and did not breathe for a while. Then, because I am thorough and because the alternative was spiraling, I did what she had told me to do. I deleted the thread. I watched the name Hollis, E, disappear from my message list. I felt, briefly, as if I had removed a tumor and also as if I had amputated a limb. Then my phone buzzed again. One more message. A different contact. A number. Not a name. An area code I did not recognize. It said, "Keep your phone on tonight." I did not know the number. I knew, instantly and with complete certainty, who had sent it. She had messaged me from a different phone so I would not have to save her in a thread that no longer existed. She had thought about this in the 2 minutes between her first reply and her second. She had thought about it enough to use a second phone. Whatever Professor Elise Hollis had spent 9 months pretending not to see, she had just confirmed, in the most institutionally careful way available to her, that she had been seeing it. I stared at the unknown number on the screen for a long time. I memorized it without meaning to. I did not reply. Replying would have been the wrong thing, and Elise Hollis had not sent the second message in order to receive a reply. She had sent it in order to make sure that, whatever I did with the next 48 hours, I did not do it alone. I put the phone on the nightstand, face up. I turned off the bedroom light. I lay on top of the covers in the dark and stared at the ceiling. I did not sleep. I want to tell you about Elise Hollis before I tell you what happened on Monday, because Monday does not make sense without her. She was 39 years old. She had come to the department 8 years ago from Cambridge, where she had done her doctoral work and her first fellowship, and had built the early version of her scholarly reputation, a reputation that had arrived in the American Academy like a closed envelope and taken 6 months to be fully opened and understood. She was, by the time she made full professor at 36, the most important scholar of Victorian epistolary fiction in the country, and possibly in her field globally. She did not wear the reputation. She wore dark blazers and silk blouses and the particular watch her grandmother had left her, and she walked through the department with an economy of movement that made every other person in the building look somehow slightly too loud. She taught 2 graduate seminars a year and supervised exactly 4 dissertations at a time. The wait list to work with her was, informally, 3 years long. I had gotten in because I had written, in my application letter, one sentence she had later told me was the reason. I had written, "Victorian women did not lack a language for desire. They lacked the audience that would survive them speaking it." I had been 23. I had been showing off. She had read the line and decided to take me on anyway, because she was, as I later learned, exactly the kind of scholar who would rather take on a student with a reckless sentence than one with a safe thesis. The first year of working with her was the most demanding intellectual experience of my life. She was patient and brutal in equal calibrated measure. She made me read everything twice. She returned my chapter drafts with margins so densely annotated I could not see the original text through the questions. She did not praise. Praise was not, in her understanding, something a teacher gave a student. Useful correction was. But at the end of my first year, when I defended my prospectus in front of the committee, she sat at the end of the table in her charcoal blazer with her hands folded and said, "This is a serious piece of work. It will be a serious dissertation. I am pleased to continue as her primary advisor." She used the third person. I pleased her. I understood on the walk home that she had given me the only form of praise she gave, the pronoun that placed me in her field. That was the first year. The second year was different. I cannot tell you when the difference started. I can tell you about specific moments. I can tell you about the conference in Berlin last September, the one where she had given the keynote and I had given a panel paper on her panel, and she had introduced me to the department chair at Yale with a specific grammatical construction. Iris Donnelly is one of my students. And I had understood, in the way one understands these things without words, that the possessive had been deliberate. I can tell you about the October afternoon when she had stayed 40 minutes past the end of office hours because we had been arguing about George Eliot. And when I had finally looked at the clock and apologized, she had said, without looking up from the page, "You are not keeping me from anything." I can tell you about the February evening when I had been working late in the graduate carols in the library, and she had walked past, and she had not stopped, but she had slowed. She had slowed, and she had looked at me across the space, and then she had moved on. There were more. There were many more. I had not counted them. I had not needed to count them. I had been cataloging them the way you catalog a weather pattern, without realizing you are doing it, because the alternative is admitting that you are watching the sky. In 9 months, she had not crossed a single line, not one. She had called me Ms. Donnelly in department settings and Iris in private ones, which was exactly as formal as she was with every student at every stage. She had never touched me, not even a hand on a shoulder, not even a brief correction of posture during a presentation. She had sent me exactly the number of emails our working relationship required, no more. She had never, by any definition a disciplinary committee would recognize, behaved improperly. And yet, the attention she gave me was specific in a way I could not account for through her professional framework alone. The pauses she took before answering my questions were a little longer than the pauses she took with the other students in the seminar room. The notes in my margins were written in a hand that was, fractionally, less formal than the hand in anyone else's. She had, over 9 months, learned the specific texture of my mind and had deployed that knowledge always, only in the service of making my work better, which was the most generous and the most unbearable thing she could have done with it. I had told exactly one person in the spring that I thought Elise Hollis was paying attention to me in a way that was not entirely professional. I had told my best friend, Juno Park, a 6th-year PhD candidate in art history who knew where every skeleton in every department was buried and had the particular survival instincts of someone who had spent 6 years watching advisors ruin their students and ruin themselves. Juno had listened. Juno had drunk her coffee. Juno had said, "Iris, if you are telling me that Elise Hollis is paying particular attention to you, then Elise Hollis is paying particular attention to you. That woman does not make accidental choices." And I had said, "But she has not done anything." And Juno had said, "That is the thing she is doing." I had not known what to say to that. I had also not, until the night of the photographs, fully admitted to myself what I was about to have to admit. I had been dating Marlowe for 6 months. Marlowe, who was kind and funny and worked in art restoration and came over on Sunday mornings with pastries from the bakery on the corner of her street. Marlowe, who I liked. Marlowe, who I was going to love, eventually, the way people love the person they land with after a long and careful and adult consideration of their options. I had been dating Marlowe the whole time I had been cataloging Elise Hollis's pauses. This was a fact I was going to have to sit with. But not tonight. Tonight I was going to not sleep, and then I was going to go to Monday office hours at 9 in the morning and find out what Elise Hollis was going to do with the thing I had just handed her by accident. Monday morning. The department building in the cold, gray January light, before the undergrad tour groups came through, before the morning seminars released their first waves of students into the corridors. I had not slept. I had not really eaten. I had put on the closest thing I owned to armor, a dark sweater and good boots, and the gold hoops I did not wear to teach. I had walked to the building at 8:47 and stood in the 3rd-floor corridor outside her office at 8:53 and rehearsed 3 different opening sentences, none of which I intended to use. Her office door was closed. This meant she was inside. The corridor smelled the way that corridor always smelled. Old radiator heat, the faint institutional trace of floor polish, and underneath it, the specific smell of a building that had housed literature departments for 100 years. Paper, leather book spines, coffee that had been brewed too early and left on too long. At 8:59 and 30 seconds, the door opened. Elise Hollis was standing in the doorway in a dark blazer and a pale gray blouse, with her hair pulled back in the particular low knot she wore on teaching days. She was not holding anything. She had opened the door at exactly 8:59 and 30 seconds because office hours began at 9, and she had known I would be there, and she had wanted me not to have to knock. She looked at me. Her face gave me nothing. "Ms. Donnelly, come in." I came in. She closed the door behind me. The office was as I had always known it. 2 walls of bookshelves, a window that looked out over the quad, a desk with 2 chairs angled toward it, a small framed print of a page from George Eliot's correspondence that she had bought in a Cambridge bookshop her first year of doctoral work and had carried with her ever since. She gestured to the chair. I sat. She did not sit. She moved to the window, stood with her hands folded behind her back, did not look at me, looked at the quad, which at 9 in the morning on a Monday in January was a gray expanse of nothing very much at all. "I am going to say 3 things," she said. Her voice was level, surgical, no warmth, no coldness. The voice she used when she was delivering something she had rehearsed because she could not afford to deliver it unrehearsed. "I did not open the attachments. I am telling you that as a matter of fact, not as a matter of comfort." I nodded. She was not looking at me. I nodded anyway. I deleted the message from my device the moment I sent my reply. I have no record of what was sent to me. You should assume that I have no record, and you should not concern yourself with the version of this situation in which I do. I did not nod. I was looking at the back of her neck, where the small hair at the base of her knot was catching the morning light. "I am aware," she said, "that what I am about to say is not a thing an advisor should have to say to a student, and the necessity of my saying it is a failure of judgment on my part and not a failure on yours." She turned. She looked at me for the first time since I had sat down. Her hands, which she had been keeping folded behind her back, came to rest on the edge of the desk. I watched them settle. I watched her distribute her weight against the desk as if she were grateful for the structural support. I watched the way she had stopped breathing with her stomach and was now breathing with just the very top of her chest, which is what people do when they are trying to keep their shoulders from moving visibly. "The reason you were able to make that mistake," she said, "is that you have been thinking about me in a way you should not be thinking about your advisor. I have been aware of this. I have been aware, more damningly, that I have been doing nothing to make it easier for you to stop." The room was very still. The correct thing for me to have done, 9 months ago, was to reassign you to another advisor. I did not do that, because your work was the most interesting work in my advisee cohort, and because I believed I could manage my own professionalism, and I was not wrong about my professionalism, but I was wrong about what I was asking of yours. I opened my mouth. She raised one hand, not sharply, gently. "Please," the hand said. "Let me finish." I closed my mouth. "The correct thing for me to do now," she said, "is to reassign you. I am going to put that on the table. And I need you to understand that it is a real option, and I will pursue it if it is what you want. It will cost you time. Not much. It will not cost you the degree. We have the calendar. You will be reassigned to Professor Celine Moreau, who is a brilliant scholar of exactly your period and will be a strong champion of your work." She paused. "I am not going to ask you to decide today." I found my voice. "Barely. What is the other option?" She looked at me. Her face, for the first time in the 9 months I had known her, did something visible. It was small, a jaw flex, a tightening around the eyes. The smallest possible acknowledgement that she was, in this moment, a person, rather than an institution. "The other option," she said, "is that I remain your advisor, and I behave, for the remaining 8 months of your dissertation, with a level of professional discipline that I should have been exercising all along. The other option is that I manage something I should have disclosed months ago while continuing to advise you, and we both pretend that the Saturday night which just occurred did not occur. I am not going to offer you that option as if it is equivalent to the first. It is not. It is the option that prioritizes my preferences over your well-being, and I have enough professional integrity to name it as such. I sat in the chair and looked at the woman who had just told me, in a grammatical construction so careful it could only have been hers, that she had spent 9 months managing a thing she should have disclosed and was now offering me the choice to end her management or extend it. I said, "You said my name." She blinked. "You said my name," I said. "Not Ms. Donnelly. Just now. You said Iris." A pause. She said, "Did I?" I nodded. She closed her eyes for 1 full second. Then she opened them. "Yes," she said. I did. Then she said, "I am sorry." I said, "For which part?" Her throat moved. "All of it," she said. I looked at her. I said, "I am going to think about what you offered." She nodded. I said, "I am going to think about it for the rest of the week. I am going to come back to this office on Friday at 4, and I am going to tell you what I want." She said, "Understood." I stood up. I was at the door. I said, "Professor Hollis." She looked at me. I said, "The second phone. The one you texted me from after." Her face gave nothing. I said, "I know what that was." She said, "I know you know." I said, "I am going to think about that too." I opened the door. I walked out. I closed the door behind me. I walked down the corridor and down the stairs and out of the building and across the quad and all the way to the coffee shop on the corner before I let myself feel anything. Then I sat in a booth and cried for 11 minutes without making any sound at all, because I was Iris Donnelly. And crying silently was something I had learned in boarding school when I was 13, and I had not forgotten how. After, I texted Juno. I texted, "I need you. Now." Juno arrived in 20 minutes. She did not ask me questions. She sat across from me in the booth and waited until I was ready, because Juno had been my best friend for 4 years, and she knew that I would say the thing when I was ready, and that pushing me would only delay it. I said, "I sent photographs to Elise Hollis by accident on Saturday night." She did not open them. She told me this morning that she has been aware for 9 months that I think about her in ways I should not, and that she has been managing her side of it. And she has offered me a reassignment to Celine Moreau, and I have asked her to give me a week to decide. Juno absorbed this without moving. She said, "Okay." She said, "Iris." She said, "Do you want the reassignment?" I looked at her. I said, "I do not know." Juno said, "Yes, you do." I looked at the coffee I had not ordered. A barista had brought it over anyway, because Juno had ordered for both of us, because Juno had been doing this for 4 years. I said, "If I do not take the reassignment, I have to finish this dissertation with the woman I am in love with, who is in love with me, and we have 8 months to pretend that we are not in love with each other." Juno said, "Is that what she said?" I said, "She said she has been managing something she should have disclosed." The word she did not say was love. But the word she did not say was love. Juno said, "Okay." Juno said, "And Marlowe." I put my head in my hands. Juno did not push. Juno drank her coffee. After a minute, she said, very quietly, "You have to tell Marlowe. Before anything else. Before Friday. You do not need to know the rest of it to know that part." I said, "I know." I sat in the booth with my head in my hands and understood that I had, over the course of 9 months, built a life that was not honest in exactly one specific place, and that the Saturday night with the photographs had not created the dishonesty. It had only revealed it. I told Marlowe on Tuesday evening. I did not tell her about the photographs. I did not tell her about Elise Hollis by name. I told her that I had realized over the past several months that I was not in the place in my life where I could give her what she deserved, and that I was so sorry, and that she had been nothing but wonderful to me, and that she deserved to hear the honest version now rather than a longer and more elaborate dishonest version later. Marlo, who was a good person, cried a little and asked me 2 questions I answered honestly, and then she said, "Iris, I think I already knew." She said, "There has been a place in you that has been somewhere else for a while." She said, "I am not angry. I am sad. But I am not angry." She left a scarf at my apartment. I put it in a bag to return to her. I did not quite return it, because 3 months later she came to pick it up herself and stayed for coffee. And by then, we had both moved forward enough that we could sit across a table and talk about art restoration and the dissertation and the weather, like adults who had once loved each other carefully and had not managed to love each other correctly, which is not a failure of love, but a failure of timing, and which is survivable, and which we both survived. But that was later. On Wednesday, I did not see Elise Hollis. I had no class with her that day. I did not go to the department. I stayed in my apartment and I read. And I did not work on the dissertation. And I thought. The dissertation sat on the corner of my desk in a stack of printed chapter drafts that were covered in her handwriting. 240 pages. I did not touch them. I could not touch them. Every page was a record of the 9 months I was trying to think my way out of, and the handwriting in the margins was the handwriting of the woman I was trying to decide whether to keep seeing or stop seeing, and the distinction between the dissertation and Elise Hollis had become, at some point I could not identify, a distinction without a difference. I read a novel instead. I read a novel that had nothing to do with the 19th century, nothing to do with women's silences, nothing to do with any field Elise Hollis had ever written in. It was, I think, the first book I had read for pleasure in 4 years. It helped. Not much, but enough. On Thursday, I saw her in the corridor. She was with Professor Tomlin, the department chair, who had been at the institution for 31 years and had navigated more complicated situations than anyone alive in the building, and had the particular dry, observant warmth of a woman who had seen too much to pretend anymore that any of it was easy. They were walking from the chair's office back toward Hollis's. Hollis saw me. Her face did not change. She nodded once, briefly, the way a professor nods at a student in a corridor. Tomlin nodded too. I nodded back. But something happened as we passed each other. A second where Tomlin's eyes went, very precisely, from my face to Hollis's and back to my face, and I understood, with absolute clarity, that Tomlin knew. Not specifics, not the photographs, but the shape of something. The department chair had been doing this for 31 years, and she was not going to be surprised by anything that happened in a literature department, and Elise Hollis had almost certainly had a conversation with her on Monday that was not entirely about the weather. I went home and thought some more. On Thursday night at 11, I realized what I had been avoiding thinking about. I realized that the question I kept asking myself, whether to accept the reassignment or not, was not the real question. The real question was the one I had been refusing to sit with for 9 months, which was whether what I felt for Elise Hollis was something I wanted to feel, or whether it was simply a thing that had happened to me in the specific conditions of being 26 years old and writing my dissertation under the attention of a woman who had, in the 300 days I had known her, been the most formidable intellectual presence of my life. The honest answer was both. The honest answer was I had fallen in love with her inside the frame of her being my advisor, and I would not have fallen in love with her without that frame, and that did not mean the falling was not real. It meant the frame had to go before I could know what was left. I wrote a paragraph to myself on a piece of paper and put it in my desk drawer because I did not trust phones anymore, and I needed to commit to the thinking. The paragraph said, I am going to accept the reassignment. Not because I want her less, because I want to find out what she is outside the room where she has authority over me. I am going to finish my dissertation under Professor Moreau, and I am going to make it the best work I can make it. And I am going to not see Elise Hollis outside of necessary departmental contexts for the 8 months of the reassignment. And then, at the end of those 8 months, if she still wants to have the conversation, And if I still want to have the conversation, we will have the conversation. Not as professor and student. As two people, whoever we turn out to be, outside the building. I put the paper in the drawer. I went to bed. I still could not sleep. Friday at 4 o'clock, I knocked on Elise Hollis's office door. She opened it immediately. She had been waiting for the knock. I came in. I sat in the chair. She did not sit. She leaned against the edge of her desk, which was a posture I had never seen her take. Informal. Available. The opposite of the way she had stood at the window on Monday. She looked at me. She said, "Tell me what you've decided." I said, "I am taking the reassignment." Her face did not change. It did not change in a specific way. The control she had was absolute, and I watched it be absolute, and I understood, for the first time, the full cost of that control. Her shoulders had gone very still. Her hands, which she had rested on the edge of the desk on either side of her, were holding the edge of the desk a little harder than the posture required. She said, "Thank you for telling me in person." I said, "I have more to say." She waited. I said, "I am taking the reassignment because I need to know what you are, and what I am, outside this room." She looked at me. I said, "If, in 8 months, when my dissertation is defended and you are no longer my advisor, and I am no longer your student, you still want to have a conversation with me, then I would like to have that conversation." I said, "I am not asking you to wait. I am not asking you to promise. I am telling you that in 8 months, the door will be open on my side." I said, "What you do with that is yours." She was very still. She said, "Iris." I said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." I said, "For what?" She said, "For being braver than I have been." I said, "I have not been brave. I have been honest." She said, "Those are the same thing." I stood up. I was at the door. I turned around. I said, "The second phone." I deleted the number. I did it Wednesday night. She said, "Good." I said, "I wanted you to know." She said, "I know." Then she said, for the first time in the 9 months I had known her, something that was not precise and not composed and not rehearsed. She said, "Iris, if in 8 months you still want to have the conversation, the door will be open on my side too." I looked at her. I said, "I know." She said, "I know you know." I said, "Goodbye, Professor Hollis." She said, "Goodbye, Iris." I opened the door. I walked out. I did not look back, because looking back would have undone something I had just built, and I had built it carefully enough to respect it. Behind me, the office door stayed open for 4 seconds. I heard it. I heard her stand there, in the doorway, watching me walk down the corridor. And I heard it close, softly, when I reached the stairwell. 8 months. 241 days if you counted the leap, which I was going to count, because I was 26 years old, and a scholar of epistolary silences and the kind of woman who counts every day. She is not allowed to say the real thing out loud. I walked down the stairs. I walked out of the building. The January light had started to turn, the way it does in the late afternoon in the northern cities, gold and thin and cold, the kind of light that makes you feel, briefly, as if the day is a thing you might be able to hold on to. I stood on the edge of the quad for a moment and breathed. 241 days. I walked home. The January light had started to go by the time I reached my street. The windows of the bakery on the corner were already lit. 2 undergraduates were arguing about something in front of the coffee shop. A dog on a long leash was standing very still, looking at a squirrel. The world was going on. The world always goes on. That is, I think, the most important thing I had learned in the 19th century. The women who wrote their letters to the people they could not quite say the real thing to. They had understood, with a precision that is nearly unbearable, that the world keeps going, and that what you do inside the continuing of the world is the only thing that is yours. I went up the stairs to my apartment. I sat on the couch. I did not turn on the light. 241 days. The paperwork for the reassignment was completed in 8 days. Celine Moreau called me on the following Wednesday, the second week of February, at 10 in the morning. Her voice on the phone was lower than I remembered from the one seminar of hers I had taken in my first year, warm, deliberate. The faint, unhurried trace of her native French still audible underneath the English she had spoken for 20 years. She said, "Ms. Donnelly, I am told I am taking over your dissertation." I said, "If you're willing." She said, "I have read the first 2 chapters. I would be a fool not to be willing." We met on Friday. Her office was on the 4th floor, 2 floors above Elise Hollis's, and it was, in almost every way, the opposite kind of room. Where Hollis's office was spare and ordered, with books shelved by period and a single framed print on the wall, Moreau's was a warm chaos of overlapping reference piles, an armchair instead of a second straight-backed chair, a fern in the corner that was somehow thriving in an institutional building that got no sun. She wore a linen shirt under a wool cardigan. Her hair was silver at the temples. She had been in the department for 22 years, and she had, Juno told me later, seen exactly this kind of reassignment happen 4 previous times in her career. She did not ask me why I was being reassigned. She did not, ever, at any point in the 8 months that followed, ask me why I was being reassigned. What she did instead was this. She sat me down in the armchair, gave me a small cup of very good coffee, and said, "Tell me what you think your dissertation is about." I told her. "For 90 minutes, I told her." And she listened the way Hollis had listened, with a total, attentive focus. But she listened differently. Hollis had listened in order to diagnose. Moreau listened in order to understand. Both are valid scholarly postures. It was only when I encountered the second one that I realized I had been working inside the first for 3 years. We went to work. The dissertation changed under Moreau's supervision, not dramatically. The argument was intact. The chapters remained where I had put them. But the voice of the thing shifted, became less defensive, less braced for a reader who was going to find the weak point and press. Moreau was not going to press. Moreau was going to believe me and then ask me to prove what I had claimed. It turned out to be a more demanding posture, not a less one, because belief requires you to deliver something real. I saw Elise Hollis for the first time in 3 weeks at a department colloquium in mid-March. She was already in the room when I arrived. She was sitting in the second row from the back, on the left side, in a dark suit, with her hair in the low teaching day knot. She did not look up when I came in. I took a seat on the opposite side of the room, in the 3rd row. Juno was beside me. Juno had promised to come to every department event for the rest of the semester, because Juno was Juno. The colloquium was given by a visiting scholar from Princeton, a woman called Dr. Avon, who I had heard speak once before, at Berlin. The topic was epistolary archives and institutional silence. It was, inevitably, a talk that could have been written specifically for Hollis's period. I did not look at Elise Hollis during the talk. I felt her. That is a thing I think people who have not done this kind of apprenticeship to a person's attention would find difficult to believe. But I felt her. I felt where she was sitting in the room. I felt when she turned a page of her notes. I felt once when she looked up at the speaker and did not look at me. Afterward, there was the usual wine and cheese reception in the department lounge, which was the kind of event where the department faculty performed collegiality and the graduate students performed being seen. I went because Moreau had asked me to, because Dr. Avon had mentioned my prospectus in her footnotes, and Moreau thought it was important that I speak with her. I spoke with Dr. Avon. She was kind and sharp, and told me, in a low voice near the cheese board, that she had read Moreau's note about the change in advising, and that she wanted me to know that if I ever needed a second reader from outside the department, she would be proud to serve in that capacity. She said this without any specific indication of why the note would have gone out, or why anyone would need a second reader from outside the department, or what any of it meant. She simply offered. I understood in that moment that Elise Hollis had made a call I had not known about. She had gone to Moreau. She had told Moreau enough, and Moreau had gone, in turn, to Dr. Avon. And Dr. Avon was telling me, at a cheese board in a department lounge, that I had a safety net I had not known existed, built quietly, without being mentioned, by the woman who had reassigned me. Elise Hollis was standing across the room. She was talking to Professor Tomlin. She had a glass of white wine in one hand that I was not at all sure she had actually sipped. Her face was the face it always was. She did not look at me. She did not look at me for the entire 90 minutes of the reception. That also, I understood, was a decision she had made. I started keeping a list, because I am the kind of person who keeps lists when I cannot control anything else. The list was called Things Elise Hollis Has Done That She Did Not Want Me to Know About. It was private. It was in a notebook. In my desk drawer. Under the paragraph I had written myself in January. Entry 1. Called Moreau. Told her enough. Did not tell her everything. Entry 2. Called Dr. Avon at Princeton. Arranged, without my knowing, the possibility of external support. Entry 3. Reported by Juno, who heard it from the department administrator, who was a notorious and reliable leaker of institutional information. Voluntarily reduced her advisee cohort from 4 students to 3. Declined to take on a new advisee for the fall. Sent a memo to the chair citing a need to rebalance her teaching load. Entry 4. Reported by Juno gleefully at the midpoint of April. Declined the keynote at the Victorianist Association's annual meeting in Chicago, which had been offered to her 2 years in advance and would have been the most visible speaking engagement of her career. Reason given: unavailability of the dates. Actual reason, as everyone in the department understood: the conference had announced as its featured early career panel a showcase of 4 doctoral students. I was on the panel. Juno said, "She scheduled herself out of a keynote so you could have Chicago." I said, "She told the association she had a conflict." Juno said, "She does have a conflict." I said, "Juno." Juno said, "Iris. The woman is handling this like she is made of glass, and you are made of something she does not want to drop." I have watched advisors make a different choice in exactly the same situation, and I am telling you right now, what she is doing is not ordinary, and you are going to have to think about that at some point. I said, "I am thinking about it." Juno said, "I know you are." Chicago happened in May. I gave my paper. I sat on the panel beside 3 other doctoral students I had known and liked for years. The audience asked me sharp questions, and I answered them with the specific clarity that comes from having spent the previous 4 years thinking about nothing else. Dr. Avon sat in the second row and nodded once at me when I made an argument she approved of, which was the highest form of acknowledgement she offered anyone. I came back from Chicago with the draft of my final chapter in my head. I wrote it in 3 weeks. I sent it to Moreau. Moreau sent it back the following week with 3 marginal notes and 1 sentence at the bottom. The note said, "This is the best chapter of the dissertation. It is also, I think, the chapter you were not able to write until you came upstairs." I cried when I read it. I was at the kitchen table. It was 9 in the evening. I put my head down on the printed pages and cried for about 4 minutes. Quietly. The boarding school way. Then I got up and heated soup and kept going. I saw Elise Hollis once more during the semester. It was in late April, in the corridor of the 4th floor, which I had no reason to be in unless I was coming from or going to Moreau's office. Hollis, I assume, had come up to consult with a colleague on the 4th floor, the medievalist who held seminars on Thursday afternoons. She was coming out of his office. I was walking toward Moreau's. We passed each other in the corridor. She slowed. She slowed in the specific way she had slowed in the library the February before. The millimeters hesitation, the shortening of the next step, the recalibration that someone watching for it would notice, and someone not watching for it would not. She did not stop. I did not stop. We passed each other at the narrowed pace of 2 people who had agreed, in January, not to have this conversation for 8 months. Her perfume was the same. I remembered it from her office. Something like cedar and dry paper, underlaid with something warmer I could never quite identify. The same thing she had worn at Berlin, The same thing she had worn at every committee meeting and every office hour and every dinner at the chair's house. She had not changed it. That had always been a decision, I realized now, though I had not named it as one until I walked past it in a corridor in April. I kept walking. At the end of the corridor, before I turned toward Moreau's office, I looked back. She was at the top of the stairs. She had stopped. She was looking at me. She did not smile. She did not raise a hand. She looked at me for 1 second, maybe a second and a half. Then she turned and went down the stairs. I went to Moreau's office. I sat in the armchair and drank the coffee Moreau handed me. Moreau looked at me for a moment before we started. She said, "We'll defend in August. I think we are ready." I said, "Okay." She said, "Iris." I looked up. She had called me Iris for the first time. 8 months of Ms. Donnelly, and now, on the day we had picked a defense date, Iris. She said, "The defense committee will be me, Dr. Lane, and Dr. Avon. I have asked Elise Hollis to serve as the external silent reader, which is a non-voting honorary role traditionally offered to the original advisor in a reassignment situation. She has accepted. She will attend the defense. She will not speak during the defense. She will not vote. She is, I believe, entitled to be present for the conclusion of the work she began." I absorbed that. I said, "Does she know the date?" Moreau said, "She requested it." I said, "Okay." Moreau watched me for a moment. She said, "The ceremony does not exist for her benefit. It exists for the proper conclusion of a scholarly process. If you are not comfortable with her presence, I will rescind the invitation. It is your defense. You have the authority in the room." I said, "I know." I said, "She should be there." Moreau nodded. We went to work. The defense was on the second Wednesday of August. I wore a gray suit. I had bought it in June specifically for the defense, and also for the postdoctoral interviews I had lined up for the fall, because Moreau had told me in July, with her small, restrained pleasure, that I was going to be the kind of candidate who got the first-round offer everywhere she applied. I had the suit professionally tailored. I wore the gold hoops. I tied my hair back, because untying it in a committee room is the kind of thing that telegraphs nerves to the very kind of committee that makes its living reading telegraphed nerves. Juno walked me to the building. At the entrance, she hugged me. Juno, who did not hug, and said, "Go be brilliant, Iris." I said, "I am going to be Iris Donnelly in there. That is enough." She said, "That has always been enough." I went up to the 3rd floor because the departmental defense room was on the 3rd floor, which was also Hollis's floor. I walked past her office. The door was open. She was inside. She was in a charcoal suit. She was at her desk. She was reading a book. She looked up when I walked past. Our eyes met for half a second. She nodded. Once. Small and complete. I nodded back. I kept walking. The defense room was at the end of the hall. Moreau and Dr. Lane and Dr. Avon were already there, along with Tomlin, who was attending in her capacity as department chair. A 4th chair had been placed at the back of the room, near the window, for the silent external reader. Elise Hollis came in 2 minutes after I did. She took the chair at the back. She did not look at me. She opened a leather portfolio on her lap. She folded her hands on top of it. She did not take a single note for the entire defense. I gave the defense of my life. 97 minutes. 6 chapters. A conclusion that tied together the argument of the dissertation, the argument that Victorian women did not lack a language for desire, but lacked the audience that would survive them speaking it, into a single, fully extended reading of 3 specific archival silences I had spent 3 years recovering. Dr. Lane asked me the hardest questions. I answered them. Dr. Avon asked me the second hardest questions. I answered those too. Moreau asked me the questions she had been asking me for 6 months, and I answered them in the refined form we had built together through March, April, May, June, and July. Hollis did not speak. She did not speak. And yet, at the 40-minute mark, when Lane asked me the question I had known she was going to ask, the question about the ethical claim of the epistolary archive, I answered it with a framework that had been entirely my own, which I had developed in April in Moreau's armchair, and which depended on an idea that Hollis had planted in my head in my second year, with a single marginal note on an early seminar paper. The note had said, "What if the silence is a rhetorical act, not a structural absence?" That idea had lived in my head for 3 years. I had grown it. I had pushed it. I had, over the 8 months under Moreau, turned it into the backbone of my dissertation. I answered Dr. Lane's question by naming the idea, not by citing Hollis. The idea had become mine too thoroughly for citation. But I said, at the start of my answer, this framework has been in my head since a marginal note a former reader wrote on an early paper of mine. I have grown it since. It is now my own. But I want to note that it began somewhere. Hollis did not move. She did not look up. She did not give any sign that she had heard me. But I saw, from where I was standing, the very small tightening at the side of her jaw. The millimeter. The tell. The thing only I, after 18 months of watching her with the particular attention of a student who had been cataloging weather, would have noticed. She had heard me. The defense ended at 97 minutes. The committee asked me to step into the hallway. I stepped into the hallway. I stood by the elevator. I counted the tiles on the floor. I did not look back down the corridor toward Hollis's office. 3 minutes later, Moreau came out and said, "Congratulations, Dr. Donnelly. You may come back in." I went back in. They had stood up. Moreau was smiling in the small restrained way she had. Lane shook my hand. Avon said, "That was excellent work." Tomlin said, "Welcome to the club." Hollis was still in her chair at the back. She stood. She walked to the front of the room with the specific unhurried economy she had always moved with, and she stopped in front of me, and she said, and this was, in a room full of her colleagues, the first words she had spoken to me in 8 months, and she said it with the full formal completeness a defense room deserves. "Dr. Donnelly, congratulations. The work is excellent. I am glad to have been present for its conclusion." She did not offer her hand. I did not offer mine. I said, "Thank you, Professor Hollis." She nodded. She turned. She left the room. She left the room the way she had always left rooms, with no indication that anything in particular had happened, with no visible cost to her composure, with the clean finality of a woman who had decided that this was the moment to exit and would not permit her body to betray the decision. But at the doorway, for 1 second, 1 second only, she paused. She did not turn back. She paused. Then she kept walking. Moreau watched her go. Then Moreau looked at me and said quietly, "The hooding ceremony is in 2 weeks. Eat something tonight. Celebrate with Juno. I will see you at the ceremony." I said, "Thank you." Moreau said, "Thank me at the hooding." I left the building. Juno was waiting outside on the quad. She took one look at my face and said, "Doctor." I said, "Doctor." She said, "Come on. We are getting drunk." We did. I texted my mother. I called my father. I ate too much pasta at a restaurant I had been saving for exactly this occasion. At midnight, walking home with Juno under a sky that had cleared for the first time in a week, I thought about the pause in the doorway. 1 second. I thought about Elise Hollis having rationed herself to 1 second. I thought about what it had cost her to stop there. I thought about what it had cost her, actually, to show up to the defense at all, to sit in the back for 97 minutes with a leather portfolio on her lap and take no notes and say nothing until the end, and then to cross the room and say the sentence she had said, and then leave before the sentence could become any longer than it was. I thought about how much of what I had just watched had been accountability, and how much had been love, and how indistinguishable, in the end. Those two things were when they were being practiced well. The hooding ceremony was on a Saturday afternoon in late August. It was held in the quad. It was the only time of the year the quad was used for anything ceremonial. A small platform had been erected. Folding chairs, a program, faculty in regalia. The usual confusion of families trying to find each other in the crowd. I was hooded by Moreau. The hood went over my head and settled on my shoulders, and Moreau, who had spent 8 months giving me the kind of supervision that had turned a pretty good dissertation into a meaningful one, smiled her restrained smile and said quietly, as she adjusted the hood, "Allez, Iris." I walked off the platform. My parents were in the second row. Juno, who was not faculty and was not family and had insisted on sneaking in anyway, was in the third row. I sat in my assigned seat among the other newly hooded PhDs and watched the rest of the ceremony the way you watch something happening to someone else, after the part that was happening to you has ended. I did not see Elise Hollis in the crowd. I realized, halfway through the closing remarks, that I had been looking for her. I stopped looking for her. After the ceremony, after the photos and the family hugs and the small campus reception in the department lounge, I walked across the quad by myself toward the coffee shop where I had cried silently 8 months earlier on the day I had come out of Hollis's office for the first time. I wanted to sit in the booth. I wanted to sit in it as Dr. Donnelly, and not as Ms. Donnelly, and to understand that the time between those two names had been a specific length, and that the specific length was over. She was sitting at a table by the window. She was not in regalia. She was in a simple dark dress and a cardigan and flat shoes. Her hair was down. She was reading a book. I stopped at the door. She did not see me at first. I watched her for perhaps 20 seconds from outside the glass. She was reading slowly, turning the pages with the specific intensity she brought to every act of reading I had ever watched her perform. A coffee sat on the table, half drunk. Then she looked up. She had known I would come here. The coffee shop on the corner was the place everyone in the department went on the day of their hooding ceremony, because the coffee shop did a special pastry for the PhDs, and the owner gave it to you for free, and it had been a department tradition for as long as anyone could remember. She had come to the coffee shop on my hooding day. She had sat by the window. She had waited. I went in. I walked to her table. She set down the book. She did not stand. She looked up at me in the specific attitude of a woman who had made a decision 8 months ago to let me come to her and was honoring that decision now by not rising from her chair. I said, "May I sit?" She said, "Please." I sat across from her. The coffee shop was mostly empty. The owner had gone into the back. The two other customers were not watching us. She said, "Dr. Donnelly, congratulations on the defense." I said, "Thank you." I said, "You came." She said, "I wanted to be there." I said, "I know." A silence. The window behind her was golden with the late August afternoon light. She looked tired in a way I had not seen her look before. Not exhausted, simply less defended. The composure was present. The armor, for the first time, was not. She said, "I owe you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "I have been working on it for 8 months. I am not sure I have it right, but I am going to say it anyway, because the date has arrived, and I promised myself I would not let the date pass without saying it." I waited. She said, "I used my authority to avoid being honest with myself, and the cost of that avoidance fell on you. I used the coaching box version of myself, the version with a title and a clipboard and a clean grammatical reason for every decision, to protect me from a version of myself I did not want to accept. When you sent the photographs, I was grateful. Not because you sent them. Because you made it impossible for me to continue the avoidance. I owe you an apology for the 9 months of avoidance. I also owe you, and this is the more difficult one to say, an apology for my gratitude. Because the gratitude implied I was glad you had to make a mistake before I was willing to be honest. And that is not a burden you should have carried. I absorbed that. I said, "That is a very thorough apology." She said, "It is what I could do." I know it is not enough. I said, "It is enough for today. It may be enough for always. I am going to think about it." She said, "Take the time." I said, "I have more to say." She said, "Of course." I said, "I have my terms." She did not flinch. She leaned very slightly forward. She said, "Name them." I said, "You will never, ever again, make a decision on my behalf that you have not told me about. Not a phone call to a colleague, not a conference you decline, not a keynote you scheduled yourself out of. If you are rearranging any part of your professional life in response to something that is mine to know about, you will tell me. I am not a fragile thing. I am not to be protected by quiet logistics. I am to be informed. I am to be consulted. She said, yes. I said, you will be a person with me, not a woman who has built an internal structure to manage the fact of me. I know the structure is who you are. I know it is how you have survived being as good as you are at what you do. I am not asking you to dismantle it. I am asking you to not deploy it against me. It can be there for the world. It will not be there for me. She said, yes. I said, and when you are wrong, because you will be wrong, because everyone is wrong, you will say you were wrong before I have to say it to you. You spent 8 months showing me that you can do this. I am not going to do 8 more months of detective work to find out when you have quietly done the next right thing. You are going to tell me. She said, Iris? I said, yes. She said, yes. I looked at her. She looked at me. I said, those are the terms. She said, I accept them. I said, then we can begin. A long silence. She said, what is beginning? I said, I am not sure yet. I think it is, specifically, the part where we find out. I think we are going to spend a long time finding out. I think the finding out is going to be the thing itself. She said, I would like that. I said, I would like it too. The coffee shop was quiet around us. Outside the window, the late August light was the gold and thin kind that only happens for about 40 minutes on certain afternoons in the last days of summer. I said, walk with me. She said, yes. She paid for the coffee. She picked up the book. She put on her cardigan. We walked out of the coffee shop together. It was the first time I had ever walked anywhere with Elise Hollis outside a building we had both been inside for professional reasons. We walked without a destination. Across the quad, past the departmental building, out the north gate, into the neighborhood beyond the campus, where the older houses were, where the trees were enormous and old and the sidewalks were uneven in the specific way sidewalks are in towns that have been growing for 200 years. We did not hold hands. We did not take each other's arms. We walked. She told me in an unhurried voice that was the new voice I was going to have to learn, the voice that was hers without her armor, the voice she had never used with me inside the building, about the first time she had read the George Eliot correspondence in the Cambridge bookshop. She told me it had taken her an hour. She had been 25. She had walked out of the shop and stood on the pavement and wept for a reason she could not at the time articulate. She told me she had found the articulation of the reason, eventually, in the second chapter of my dissertation. I said, you never told me that. She said, I know. I said, why not? She said, because I could not tell you that inside the building. I said, we are not inside the building now. She said, no. She stopped walking. We were under a large oak tree on a residential street I had never been on before. The light was coming through the leaves in the particular broken way August light comes through late summer leaves. I stopped walking with her. She said, Iris. I said, yes. She said, I am going to do something now, and you are going to tell me if I have read the terms correctly. I said, okay. She lifted her hand, slowly, without apology, without hurry, and she touched my jaw. Just the edge of her fingers, against the line of my jaw. Warm. Specific. The first time she had touched me in 18 months. Then she let her hand rest there. Not holding. Just resting. She said, this is what I have been not doing for 9 months and then 8 months. And now, altogether, almost a year and a half. I am telling you now, with complete honesty, that this is the restraint I have been holding. I am going to hold it for 1 more second. And then I am going to ask you if I should stop holding it. I said, do not ask. Stop holding. She stopped holding. She leaned in. The kiss was not frantic. It was patient. It was earned. It was the specific exhale of a woman who had held herself still for 18 months and had decided, finally, to stop being still. Her hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, under my hair. Warm, careful, present. I felt her breathe, a single long breath she had apparently been holding too. And then her other hand found my waist and settled there like a promise, rather than a claim, and we stood there under the oak tree in the late August light and did the simple, honest thing that 18 months of careful discipline had been refusing us. When she finally stepped back, she did not step all the way back. She kept her hand at my waist. She looked at me with the face I had never seen her wear. Not composed, not armored. Open, she said. Okay. I said, okay. She said, will you come to dinner? I said, yes. She said, tonight. I said, tonight. She said, I should warn you, I am not very good at this. I have spent the last 18 months being very specifically not good at this. I suspect I will be clumsy. I said, I will be patient. She said, thank you. I said, I have been patient for 18 months. I have developed a skill. She almost laughed. The corner of her mouth moved. 2 millimeters this time. More than I had ever been given. We walked back through the neighborhood toward my apartment. She did not hold my hand. I did not take her arm. But she walked close enough that our shoulders touched once, around the corner of the last block, and she did not move away. That was the first day. It was not the fastest beginning. Both of us, in our different ways, had learned to move through the world with too much intention to rush anything. We took the fall carefully. We had dinners. We had Saturday mornings and Sunday afternoons, and a very specific Thursday ritual that involved the bookshop near the river and coffee afterward. She was, as she had warned me, clumsy at some of it. She did not know how to text in the register of a person rather than an advisor, and it took her about 6 weeks to stop proofreading her messages to me for 3 minutes before sending them. She apologized for the proofreading when I noticed it. I told her to keep proofreading for another 2 weeks if she needed to. She kept proofreading for exactly another 2 weeks, and then she stopped. And the first unproofread message she sent me was a photograph of a dog she had passed on her morning walk, with the caption, "This dog reminded me of you." I have no idea why. I laughed for about 6 minutes in my apartment alone over that. I sent her back. I am glad to be reminded of, even by a dog. She replied, I would not say that of every dog. I replied, I should hope not. That was the first honest exchange we ever had in writing. I saved it. I still have it. I took the Yale postdoctoral fellowship in October. It meant moving, for 2 years, to New Haven. We spoke about it before I accepted, about what 2 years apart would mean, about what a long-distance version of a relationship still in its beginning would require. She said, take the fellowship. We will be fine. She said it in the new voice, the honest one, without the grammatical hedges she had used to buy herself distance when I was her student. I took the fellowship. The 2 years in New Haven were the best professional years of my life to date. I published the dissertation. I gave a keynote at Berlin in the 2nd year. Elise flew in for the keynote. Alone, not officially, in a plain coat and no name tag. And she sat in the back of the auditorium the way she had sat at my defense, and she took no notes, and she was visible in the audience to me only because I had spent 3.5 years learning to know where she was in a room. Afterward, at the reception, Dr. Avon saw us standing together near the window. She walked over. She looked at Elise. She looked at me. She smiled. She said, Elise, you came. Elise said, of course I came. Dr. Avon said, I am glad. She did not say anything else. She raised her glass to both of us and walked back to the main cluster of the reception. That was the first public moment. That was the moment we were seen together by someone who had known us both inside our professional positions and had understood what it meant to see us standing near a window at a conference reception and had chosen to say, of course I came back to Elise, in a tone that contained exactly the right amount of nothing and everything. Elise, for the first time in the 3 years I had known her, did not flinch at a public moment. She looked at me instead. She said, Was that all right? I said, That was perfect. She said, Good. She picked up her glass. She took a small, real sip of her wine. She said, I am enjoying myself. I am noting that, for the record. I do not always know how to notice when I am enjoying myself, and I am trying to practice doing so out loud. I said, Thank you for noticing. She said, I thought the terms required it. I said, The terms do require it. She said, Then I am enjoying myself. And I am here with you. And I would like you to know that. I said, I do know. She said, Good. I finished the fellowship. I came home. I took a tenure-track position at a smaller university an hour from her, close enough that we lived together most of the time, far enough that I had my own life in my own department. Juno, who had finished her own dissertation by then and taken her own position at a museum in the city, bought us both housewarming gifts and told Elise, in her particular voice, You broke my best friend's heart for 9 months. I have forgiven you. I am watching you. Elise said, Thank you, Juno. Please continue to watch me. I find it clarifying. Juno almost smiled. Juno almost liked her. Juno eventually liked her. We married on a Saturday in September. We were 31 and 43. The ceremony was small, and in the garden of the house we had bought together the year before. Moreau walked me in, because Moreau had earned that. Juno was my best woman. Elise's sister, who had flown in from Edinburgh, stood with her. Dr. Avon gave a reading from George Eliot's correspondence that made half the audience cry, including Elise, whose crying I had not seen before that day, and which I had to pretend not to notice because noticing it would have embarrassed her, and the terms, even on our wedding day, still held. Later, in the kitchen, after the last of the guests had gone, Elise and I stood at the sink. She was rinsing a wine glass. I was drying. The kitchen smelled of lemon and the last traces of the cedar and paper perfume she had been wearing since I had known her, which she still wore, because she had made the decision about it at 26, and did not see any reason to revisit. She said, Iris? I said, Yes. She said, I have been thinking about the photographs. I said, Which photographs? She said, The ones you sent me, by accident, on a Saturday night almost 4 years ago. I said, Oh. Those photographs. She said, I never opened them. I said, I know. She said, I still have not opened them. I deleted the file without looking. The way I told you. I said, I know. She said, I want you to know that if you ever, in the course of our marriage, accidentally send me something intended for someone else, I reserve the right, now, to open it. I said, That is remarkably bold of you. She said, We have been married for 6 hours. I am establishing the precedent. I said, I am establishing a counter-precedent. If I ever, in the course of our marriage, accidentally send you something intended for someone else, I reserve the right to have a very serious conversation with you about who the someone else is. She said, Fair. She said, Iris. I said, Yes. She said, There is no someone else. I said, I know. She said, There has not been a someone else for a very long time. I said, I know that too. She kissed me at the sink, with wet hands and a dish towel between us, and it was the most ordinary kiss in the world, and it was also, in the specific way certain ordinary things are, after a long waiting, completely extraordinary. Outside, the garden lights were still on. The last of the September warmth was in the air. Somewhere, in the drawer of the desk in my study upstairs, the piece of paper I had written myself 8 Januaries before was still folded. Waiting. Useless now, because the conditions had all been met. The door had been open on my side. The door had been open on her side. We had walked through both doors eventually, in our own time, in our own way, together.